right, so moving along into the last of our Egyptian tales. This one is called Satni-Khamois and the Mummies, and it dates from the Ptolemaic period. So we're all the way at the end of Egyptian civilization here. It is in full decline, and this is a very good story, though. In some ways, it's my favorite of all these stories. Now, we've seen two different types of stories. The realistic stories, such as the tale of the eloquent peasant, the story of Sinui, and the ill-fated voyage of Wenamun. And both Sinui and Wenamun may actually be factual accounts. The scholars debate on that. Tale of the eloquent peasant is probably not, but they're all in the realistic mode. High works of literary art, very carefully crafted, whereas the other works clearly have come from the oral tradition. These are the fairy tales, the story of the shipwrecked sailor, and the other two that we saw, the doomed prince, and the third one there. What was it? The tale of the doomed prince. What did I do after the tale of the doomed prince? It was the two brothers. So, yeah. All right. So then, fairy tales and the fantastic, which have clearly come from the oral tradition. They're literarily kind of sloppy, and that's a trademark of the oral tradition. That's how you can tell that the scribes who have written them down have had the stories told to them, and they have written them down. So we have these two genres, and Satni-Khamois fits into the genre of the fairy tale, the fantastic story. And so it dates from the Ptolemaic period. Now, the Ptolemaic period is, of course, just after the conquests of Alexander the Great. So we're looking at a period from about 300 BC down, or 330, right in there, BC, all the way down to Cleopatra and the Battle of Actium, which is, 30 BC. That's the Ptolemaic period, when then, after Cleopatra loses the Battle of Actium with Mark Antony, then the Romans come in. And then the Romans take over Egypt. They're there for all the way down to the 4th century. So this is the Ptolemaic period, and there are Greek influences in this story. There are Greek echoes, and the story, if you're familiar with the Greek novels, what are called the Greek romances, which were a form of popular culture that were basically derided by the highbrow elites. They were sort of like the movies of their time. You can kind of sense in this work that it's moving in that direction. Certain aspects of it remind me of Lucius Apuleius' Golden Ass, which is probably the best and most famous of those Greek novels. So we're headed in that direction. The Greeks are reading these stories and loving them. So this is part of the cultural interchange and hybridization now of the Greeks with the Egyptians, from out of which will come the Corpus Hermeticum. And there are certain aspects of this that remind me of the Corpus Hermeticum with regard to this book of Thoth that's in here. And then, of course, eventually with philosophy, with Plotinus, and all of this will synthesize and hybridize these two civilizations as they die, as they are both dying. Egypt is a dead museum by this point. And in a way, this story, you can see it as a kind of dead museum, because the main character, Satni-Khamois, is based on a real person. This was the 4th son of Ramses II, back about 1300 BC. So this was he was a high priest of the god Ptah at Memphis, and scholars regard him in many ways as Egypt's first Egyptologist, because this guy was fascinated with going back over the history of his own civilization, restoring monuments, reading inscriptions, studying it. And so by the time we get to this Ptolemaic version, this fanciful version of his life, we can see that Egypt is a dead museum. And the other thing about this story, as we'll see, is that the magical consciousness structure, which Jean Gebser talks about, is very strong in Egypt, less so in Mesopotamia. But the first generation of civilization, with Mesopotamia on the one hand and Egypt on the other, represent the mythical consciousness structure, which is a stratum that lies atop the magical consciousness structure. But in Egypt, that magical consciousness structure was hybridized with the mythical, which you can see in this story. It's very, very strong. This is a story about dueling magicians, casting spells. So the magical consciousness structure remained very strong, as well as the cult of ancestor worship in Egypt also remained very, very strong, which is the beginnings of the sort of Asiatic mentality that flows out of Egypt and goes on into the second generation of high civilization with India and China and their reverence for ancestor worship and so forth. So as the story opens up, then this guy is out wandering around, reading texts, studying monuments, reading inscriptions, and when an old man comes to him and approaches him and says, "What are you doing all this for? This is a waste of time. What you want is the Book of Tot." The Book of Tot was written by the god Tot himself, and it's the ultimate text that contains two fundamental spells in it. The first spell, when you recite it, will give you power over, you will understand the language of nature. You'll understand the language of the birds and the fishes. You'll have power over nature. And the second spell, you'll be able to see the gods. You'll be able to see, so in other words, the first spell is magical, the second spell is mythical. The second spell will plug him into the mythical consciousness so he can see Re and the Ennead and all the gods. He says, "Where's this book? I have to have it." He says, so this takes place in Memphis at Saqqara. So in a way, as we come to the last of our Egyptian stories, we come back full circle to the Old Kingdom where everything began with Memphis, the priests of Ptah, and the original burial place of the pharaohs was at Saqqara. Then it shifts to Giza with the fourth dynasty, but it was originally Saqqara in the first two dynasties. So this takes place at Saqqara, and the guy's name is Nanefer-Kheptah, that he has to go to his tomb. The old man says, "Go to this guy's tomb, find it, and you'll see that the Book of Tot is in there." And actually, this guy is Nanefer-Kheptah. This is one of his avatars. He's a master magician. He's dead, but he has command of so much power that he can appear in the form of avatars. So he grabs his foster brother, Satni does, Inaros is his name, and they decide to go find this tomb. They go down into it, they open it up, and there is Nanefer-Kheptah. His mummy is there, and he is there visually as well. But his wife Ahura is there, and their son Merib. Except that the wife and the son don't have the mummies there. They're only Kas. And he can conjure them forth because he has such magic power and talk to them, but he wants those mummies, and the mummies are buried at Koptos, which is in the south. So there's a pendulation or an oscillation here in this story between Memphis and Koptos, up the river, back down it, back and forth to get the mummies. And so he says, "I want the Book of Tot." And the woman Ahura says, "No, you don't. Let me tell you our story." So now here's that Asiatic device of the story within the story that has nested stories that we talked about before, which is a standard characteristic of Asian stories. And she tells a huge chunk of the narrative here in first person. Now, not that the Egyptians invented first person narration, because it comes out of the autobiographies of the tomb inscriptions of the nobles from the Old Kingdom. They invented the I did this, I did that. Whereas the Mesopotamians, as far as I know, there are no Sumerian or Babylonian stories that are told in the first person. They're all third person. Interesting difference between these two civilizations. So anyway, so she proceeds to tell the story of her and her brother. Nanefer-Kheptah is her brother and also her husband. Incest between brothers and sisters was legal and perfectly normal in Egypt. It was totally accepted. Nobody batted an eye about it, and it was very common. So they wanted to get married, and their father, that was the pharaoh at the time, he kind of discouraged it. He was like, wouldn't Ahura, wouldn't you rather marry the son of a general, and we could marry your brother off to the daughter of a general? Wouldn't that be a better idea? And she says, no, I'm in love with my brother. I want him. And then Pharaoh says, okay, if that's what you want, here you go. So they marry, and they have this child named Merib, who is a scribe. And so that happens. And then meanwhile, Nanefer-Kheptah is out wandering, and this links back to the opening scene. So now he's in the role of Satni-Khamois when he's out wandering, reading inscriptions, becoming a master magician, studying the tombs, like an Egyptologist, just like Satni-Khamois, just going through and studying the past of this ancient civilization that is a dead museum. So he's walking around, and then an old man approaches him, just as he had approached Satni-Khamois at the beginning of the story. So an old man approaches him and laughs at him and says, "You don't want this stuff. You want the Book of Tot. The Book of Tot is the thing that contains two great spells in it that will give you power over everything." And then Neferkeptah says, yeah, so you'll tell me where it is? And he says, yes, I will. And he says, what can I do for you then? And he says, give me I need 100 debens of silver for my tomb, and also a couple of coffins made for me. And he says, done. So he gives him that, and then the guy tells him, okay, the Book of Tot is buried underneath the river at Koptos. So you have to go there. And what you'll find is that it's nested within an iron box, and then within that is a bronze box, and then within that is a wooden box. It's either cinnamon wood or pine, something like that. And then the next box is made out of ebony and ivory, and then you'll find a silver box, then a gold box, and underneath the gold box you'll find the chest containing the text. Now, of course, this is a reference to the practice of burying mummies. The way the Egyptians did this was to nest it. Tutankhamun's tomb is a perfect example of this, where the innermost coffin is made out of gold. So there's the mummy, which is already wrapped in linen. So that's layer number one. Layer number two is the gold coffin. Then there are two wood coffins, a wooden coffin, then another wooden coffin within that. So it's within, like Russian dolls. And so we get the wooden coffin, and then the whole thing is placed into a stone sarcophagus. So this nested idea of sheaths is most likely the origins of the Indian Vedantic philosophical idea that the soul is contained within sheaths. There is a lot of commerce between Egypt and India, and they probably had this idea, which it appears you can also find it in the Corpus Hermeticum. It's there too, but in India and Vedanta it's stated very clearly. The Anamaya kosha is the sheath made of food, the physical body. This is the Anamaya, Maya made kosha sheath is the physical body. Then the next one in is the Pranamaya kosha, which is the etheric body that animates it, all the meridians and so forth. So it goes from Anamaya kosha to Pranamaya kosha to then the Manamaya kosha, which is the mind, which is tied in with these outer three. If something bad happens to the physical body, then the mind gets pessimistic. Life sucks. Everything is terrible. You become a Schopenhauer, let's say. But then there's a gap. And then there's the Vijnanamaya kosha, which is the sheath made of wisdom, which is the wisdom that is inherent in grass that makes it grow, in trees that make them grow. They don't need an intellect to figure out how to do these things. That's a deeper wisdom than the Manamaya kosha, which is attached to the outermost sheath. And then finally we get to Anandamaya kosha, the sheath made of rapture, of bliss. Everything in the world, even underneath the suffering of what happens to the Anandamaya kosha, is a manifestation of bliss, ecstatic rapture. Then, of course, the soul. And then you have the Atman, the central core of all of this. Just as here, in place of that, and in place of Pharaoh, we will find the Book of Tot. So this is what the old man tells him. They make this exchange, and he goes to the Pharaoh, then Setni does, and says, I want to borrow, or not Setni, Neferkeptah, says, I want to borrow the royal barge and go down to Koptos and get this book. And Pharaoh says, here you go. Here's the keys to my car. Make sure you return it in good condition. And so he gets on the boat, loads up his wife Ahure and the son married. So they go as a family down to Koptos. When they get there, they have a festival with the priests of Isis there, lots of fun, drinking and dancing and so forth. And then, so then what he does is he takes some wax and he forms it into a magical boat with a crew. And this is a reference to the fact that during the first intermediate period that immediately follows the collapse of the Old Kingdom, a new type of burial style arose where they started making three-dimensional models, carefully painted, of figures that would help you in the afterlife, of houses that you would want to live in. And you could just, when you got to the afterlife, magically animate these things and make them real. So that's what he does. He casts a spell over this wax boat with its crew, and they become real. And he leaves the wife and kid behind. He gets on this boat, and he says, take me to the spot where the Book of Tot is buried, in the river. So the guys row. Apparently they know where it is. And they take him there, and he finds the spot. He does a magic spell which splits the waters, just like Moses, opens the waters, and there he finds that collection of the iron casing and the bronze and the wood, ebony and ivory and silver, gold. There's the chest containing the text, except that it is surrounded and guarded by snakes and scorpions, just like something out of the Indiana Jones movies. So he casts a magical spell to dispel all of them, but there's a master snake there that you cannot simply cast a spell on. And he tries cutting off its head, and two more grow in its place. So this is the influence of Greek myth now. This is the Hydra, the Lernaean Hydra that Hercules has to slay. And so he keeps fighting it, and the heads keep growing back, and finally he chops it in two, separates it, casts a spell on it, and defeats it. Then he can get access to the Book of Thoth, which he does. So then he reads it, and now he can understand the language of the birds, the language of nature. This is the same thing in Germanic myth when Siegfried slays the dragon and drinks from its blood and understands what the birds are saying. It's the exact same myth. So he has this understanding. Then the second spell allows him to see Re and the Ennead and all the gods, and he's like, great, this is fantastic. So he has the magical men on the rowboat take him back to his wife, and she says, oh, I want to see the book. She can't read, she's not literate, but he shows it to her, and she pronounces the spells. I guess he tells them to her because it specifically says she's not literate. And then she has this insight, and she says, oh, wow, this is a really powerful text. Now what are we going to do? He says, well, let's head back to Memphis. Mission accomplished here. Loads up the wife and the kid. And as they're going up the Nile, now meanwhile what has happened is that the god Thoth himself has seen what has happened, and he's very angry that this guy has stolen his book without his permission. So he goes to Ray and he says, I have a grievance with this guy, and I want to put a curse on him. Ray says, go right ahead. So he does. He puts a curse on him. So as they're going back to Memphis on the river, the kid, Mary, falls out over the side of the boat and drowns. He is able to cast a magic spell to bring the body back up and temporarily animate the kid to tell him what happened. So they have to take the kid back to Coptos and bury him there. So that's done. So he and the wife, Ahura, get back on the boat. Now remember, she's telling this from her first person account. She gets back on the boat. They go, and as they go right past the same spot, she falls into the river and drowns. She's telling the narrative from the point of view of her Ka, but she's dead, so he has to go back and bury her at Coptos. So that's why the mummies of the wife and kid are buried at Coptos. And then so as he gets back on the boat, he realizes something bad is probably going to happen to him. So he takes the Book of Thoth and ties it to himself, ties it, I guess, around his neck. And so then when he falls in the water and drowns, the magic of the book is such that his body is not just down in the water, but it's dragged along by the barge as it goes back to Memphis, where Pharaoh finds it, and he has it buried. So that's how he wound up then in Saqqara, with the Book of Thoth in the grave, minus the mummies of his wife and kid, which is why he has manipulated now Satni-Khamois to come in here and get the mummies for him. So it's all a manipulation going on. So she finishes her story. She's done. Satni says, I want the book, and if you don't give it to me, I'll take it by force. So it's your choice. And then the Neferkeptah says, well, you can try and take it by force, or we can play a game of drafts, and we'll do it that way. Satni says, I'm game, let's do it. Bring out the board. The Egyptians loved this game. So they play. Satni loses, of course, and so what happens is he bangs him on the head with the game board, and Satni sinks into the ground up to his knees. So they play again. Does the same thing, bangs it on his head. He sinks into the ground up to his waist. They do it again. He loses a third and final time, and he sinks all the way up to his neck into the ground. Fortunately now his foster brother is there, and I think this is the only reason why he's in the story, because it's the only time he does anything. And he tells his foster brother, go back to Pharaoh and get my amulets that are sacred to Ptah, because I need them. So he rushes over, tells Pharaoh, give me the amulets, and then he comes back to the tomb, and he puts the amulets on Satni-Khamois, and he pops up out of the ground. And then he says, I'm taking the book anyway, and he grabs it, and they leave. And the tomb then darkens, because the book is like a miniature sun that has radiated the tomb with light. And as he leaves with the book, it goes dark, and Ahura says, oh, there goes our light. I'm sad now. And then Neferkeptah says, don't worry about it. He'll be back here with a brazier on his head and a forked staff in his hand, which is the symbol, the hieroglyph for Egyptian defeated enemies. So then So now Satni-Khamois has the text, and he's walking around reading it, and then he notices there's a beautiful woman. Wow. And she's got a retinue about her, and he has his servant go tell her, listen, I'll pay you 10 pieces of gold if you let me sleep with you for an hour. She says, I'm not a harlot. But then she says, well, if you really want that, okay, you'll have to come back to my place. She's a priestess of the god Bastet, the cat goddess, and living in Bubastis. So he has to go find her house in Bubastis, which he does. It's this nice, elaborate place. She's obviously not in any need of money. But he goes in anyway, and he says, okay, let's do business. And she says, that's fine, but first, you're going to have to sign over to me all your possessions, everything you own. So now, this is, of course, a fairy tale motif. Now we're in the realm of magic here. To a certain extent, this is real, but to a certain extent, it's not. This is actually Ahura in disguise as this woman named Tabubu, and but it's her. And so her and her husband are in charge here, and Satni-Khamois is losing the game. Signs it over, all his possessions. And then she says, okay, now I need another document to make sure your children will not dispute my possessions. So sign here. And he signs again. And then finally she says, and now I want your children to be killed to make sure that they're out of the way. He's like, all right. He signs again. This is like the origin of the Faustian bargain. This is where it begins. But on the other hand, I've known women like this, scam artists, proliferate today. I've encountered many of them. Total con artists. So not much has changed in the world as far as human types go. And so he signs everything away. He says, all right, let's do it. She says, okay, we're going to do it. She has his children killed, thrown out the window to the dogs. The dogs rip the bodies apart. So they go into the bedroom, and he lies on the bed. He gets naked. She's naked. And then she screams rape on him. So now he's lost everything, all of his possessions. He's had a magical curse put on him. This is the magical consciousness structure after all. And she screams rape. So that, and then it ends, he wakes up, that sort of chapter ends, and he wakes up, and there's Pharaoh now. Pharaoh has come in and says, what are you doing? What's going on here? He explains to Pharaoh everything that has happened, the whole story of his misfortunes. And the Pharaoh tells him, listen, I told you to put that book back, and that it was a bad idea to take it in the first place. Now you need to return it to Na-Nefer-Kheptah in that tomb. So he realizes that he has to, so he puts the brazier on his head, has the forked staff of humiliation and defeat, and goes back down into the tomb where the three of them are. And he says, here's the book. And Na-Nefer-Kheptah says, oh, nice of you to return it. Now you have to do one more thing. You have to go down to Coptos and get the mummies of Ahura and Merib and bring them back here so we can all be together. So he does. In defeat, he has to admit defeat. So he goes down to Coptos. He finds the house underneath which these bodies have been buried. They destroy the house. There's an old man there, which is, again, Na-Nefer-Kheptah, who tells him how to find where the bodies are buried. Finds the bodies, puts them on the barge, and brings them back up to Saqqara. And that's the end of the story. So he's in total defeat. However, there is a cycle of Satni-Khamois stories. So there's another one with him, with his son, who is also a master magician. So he's a hero that was associated with a number of tales, kind of like the Arthurian romances. So that's that tale.